Plot summary of Black Boy by Richard Wright. The story starts in 1912 in a small town in rural Mississippi. The author and main character, Richard Wright, lives with his brother, mother, and father. At the age of 4, Richard gets bored and almost sets fire to their house. His mother and father used a switch to beat him badly. Soon after that, they move to Memphis, where Richard's dad leaves them. Richard's mother works in white kitchens to support Richard and his brother, but she can't make enough money, so the boys are sent to an orphanage in Memphis run by a kind woman named Miss Simon. Even though Miss Simon likes Richard, he doesn't like living in the orphanage. He won't take money from his father to help him stop being so hungry. In the end, Richard's mom moves him and his brother back and forth between her mother's house in Jackson, Mississippi, and her sister Maggie's house in Arkansas. Rich tavern owner Hoskins, Maggie's husband, is killed by whites while Richard's family lives with them. Then, Richard's mother has a stroke and is very close to dying. Richard moves in with his grandmother in Jackson, and his brother moves in with Maggie in Detroit. Richard doesn't like how Granny raises him and how she insists on Christian dogma, so he starts school in Jackson. He buys as many books as his money will let him. He also starts writing stories, which his classmates and family, like his aunt and schoolteacher Addie, don't understand. Richard has a number of odd jobs during the summer and before school so he can buy more food and books. Even though he has missed a lot of school, he does well from 6th to 9th grade and is named valedictorian of his 9th grade class. The principal gives him a speech to give in front of a mixed-race crowd. But Richard thinks he should give his own speech, so he does, which angers the principal and costs him his job as a teacher in the Jackson schools. At age 17, Richard decides to move to the north to get away from racism in the south. Richard has trouble giving in to white authority at work, but his friend and schoolmate Griggs tells him that if he wants to keep his job, he needs to be fake nice to white people. Griggs recommends Richard for a job as an assistant at an optometry shop in Jackson, which is run by a kind northerner named Crane. However, Crane's racist white assistants, Pease and Reynolds, try to scare and threaten Richard out of the job. Richard then gets a job in a hotel, even though he is afraid that white customers will hurt him if they think he is hanging out with the white prostitutes who use the hotel as a brothel. He later gets a job as a ticket taker at a movie theater. At the second job, he works with 2 other black employees to steal ticket sales from the owner. This gives him enough money to sneak out of Jackson at night and move to Memphis. There, Richard rents a room from Mrs. Moss, whose daughter Bess is in love with Richard and wants to marry him. Richard says no and gets a new job at another optometry shop, where he makes friends with other black men who work in the building, like Shorty, who runs the elevator. Richard saves money in Memphis and starts reading a lot after a kind white man named Falk gives him a library card. Richard's mother, brother, and Aunt Maggie move back to Memphis to be with him, and they all decide to run away to Chicago together. Wright says at the end of part 1 that he'll always have a piece of the South with him. He hopes that he may live a freer and more rewarding life in the North. Part 2 takes up immediately afterward. Richard and his Aunt Maggie live with their Aunt Cleo. Richard's mother and brother will join them later. Richard has a lot of jobs. He works as a porter at the Hoffman's Deli, but his ideas about race are shaped by the Jim Crow South, and he can't get rid of them. For instance, Richard thinks that the Hoffmans won't let him take time off work to take the Postal Service test. So, when he does take the test, Richard tells Mr. Hoffman that his mother died in Memphis. Hoffman doesn't believe Richard, and Richard doesn't admit to his lie. He feels bad about himself and quits the deli. He then gets a job washing dishes. He eventually gets a temporary job with the Postal Service, but he has to leave because he doesn't weigh at least 125 pounds. When the Great Depression hits, Richard has fewer jobs to choose from. He gets insurance policies from black families on the South Side, and he has an affair with a woman who has one. Wright is both interested in and confused by black life in Chicago. Many black people, like this unnamed woman, think Wright sounds like an intellectual when he talks. Wright will have to go to the relief office at some point to get food for his family. This office puts Richard in the animal lab of a fancy hospital where white people make up most of the staff. Richard works with Bill, Brand, and Cook, who are all black men. Doctors at the hospital don't pay much attention to the black people who work there because they think they don't know anything about medicine or science. One doctor plays a prank on Richard. When Brand and Cook get into a violent fight, they knock the animals out of their cages, and the four men must put animals back without knowing the experiments to which they belong. Even though Richard is afraid they'll lose their jobs, no doctor ever finds out. Richard cycles in and out of the postal service as work becomes available. There, he meets white workers who are part of the Communist Party. Most of them are Irish or Jewish. They try to get Richard to go to meetings of the John Reed Club, which is a group of communist writers. Richard does, and he finds that the club's journals are happy to publish his poems and short stories. Even though Richard has only been in the club for 2 months, the other members choose him to be their leader. Richard gets a crash course in communist politics, which includes the fact that there are often fights within the party. Wright joins the party officially, but he says that the club's writings should be creative and imaginative, not just propaganda. This puts Richard at odds with party leaders like Buddy Nielsen and Ed Green, who want Reed Club writers to follow the party line. Richard is getting less and less interested in party work. Ross is also a black communist, and he talks to him for a series of biographical sketches. Even though Wright is turning these sketches into stories and publishing them, the party is still not sure about this work. As things get worse between him and the party, Richard gives up his membership, but he doesn't give up on communism as a political ideal. The relief office moves Richard between jobs at the Boys Club on the South Side and the Federal Negro Theater. Richard becomes friends with Dashim, the white theater director who supports experimental work. But the black actors don't like this work, and they call Richard a Uncle Tom because he likes Dashim more than them. Richard is moved to the Federal Writers Program, where he can't talk to communists, who used to be his party friends. Richard goes to a fake trial where his old friend Ross confesses to crimes against the party and asks for forgiveness. Richard figures out that the party is a lot like the Christian church where he grew up in the South. Richard marches in a May Day parade with a group of communists, but some of them kick him out because he left the party. At the end of part 2, Richard goes back to his small apartment, where he makes a promise to himself: he will build a writing career on his own, but he will take with him everything he's learned about race relations and American society, and his writing will always be open to the idea that people can get along.
About the author. Richard Wright grew up in Mississippi and Tennessee. His aunt and grandmother raised him most of the time. Richard Wright did very well in school until he had to drop out of high school and work to help support his family. In 1927, he moved to Chicago, a city that helped him grow as a writer and thinker. Wright was 16 when his first short story was published. Wright joined the Communist Party for a while when he lived in Chicago. After writing his first novel, Laud Today, which wasn't very popular, he moved to New York City in 1937. There, he published Uncle Tom's Children, a collection of short stories, in 1938, and Native Son, a novel, in 1940, which launched his career and brought him national attention. Wright's Black Boy, a story about his childhood that was partly made up, came out in 1945 and also made him famous. Wright moved to Paris in 1946 and mostly stayed there until he died in 1960. Wright was a big influence on other African American writers of the time, like Ralph Ellison, who wrote Invisible Man, and James Baldwin, who would later criticize Wright's work harshly but always say that it influenced their own.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.